Welcome to Ed Pop, where we discuss problems of practice in education and everything in between. I'm Seamus O'Hara.
I'm Catherine Bussert.
And I'm Sean Wheeler.
On today's episode, we look at the history and current state of compulsory education, as well as nature-based learning, Hattie's effect size, and much more. Let's start with a little faculty meeting. Hey, it's me, Seamus. I'm here in Cleveland, and I'm walking the hallways of a typical American high school. All around me, I see a bunch of students transitioning to their next class, and they don't seem like they're in a giant rush to get there. We've seen this before. Schools around America have students that just do not seem to want to be in their next class. And we don't really question how we got here. So the question is, just how did we get here? Compulsory education means kids have to go to school. Now, there are certain times of the year which they do not have to go, and certain exceptions can apply, such as age of the child, alternatives, and other waivers. And with this compulsory system, there is supposed to be enforcement. Pretty much every person age 5 to 18-ish needs to be accounted for. States have some control on the amount of required days, but it's usually around like 180 just about everywhere. Local schools, administrators, and municipal courts are like, guys, you have to be in school, please. Ultimately, parents or guardians are the ones in hot water for attendance issues. The penalty could be a fine or jail. Nothing is really done until school efforts are proven to be unsuccessful. It happens a lot, right? No. So what naturally makes sense for school admins to do to students that are not going to school? Suspend them. Because they need more time out of school, apparently. So where did this all start? It's hard to identify. Many cultures throughout history have systems to educate the youths. In 16th century England, everyone wanted to do something about their issue with destitute youths. They set up a vocational program in connection to poorhouses to fix that one. That seems kind of familiar. In early America, orphans and troubled kiddos were legally required to go to apprenticeships. And by the 18th century, they started to make sure everyone could study the Bible by teaching reading and writing as a regular thing to children. They wanted all kids to be able to read and write and have a trade. Again, seems familiar. Well, it's the 19th century, and now people are like, maybe the government needs to get involved in schooling, and maybe we need to make the kiddos not have to go to work, and instead go to school. See, schools were still a very much private entity at that time. In 1852 was the Massachusetts School Attendance Act. It was pretty loose and vague about enforcement, but did require some schooling for some kids at some point. By 1900, there were Catholic immigrants on the rise. Interestingly enough, public schools were favorable to American Christians for their lack of religion. They were okay with making Catholic kids not go to Catholic school because they wanted to assimilate them. The Supreme Court ultimately said, no, you can't do that. They can go to Catholic schools if they want. By 1917, compulsory education was pretty much in every state, although the South was a little slow to get on board because agriculture. Some hallmark court cases had set precedents that basically said having kids in school is what is best for society. For example, in 1901, the state of Indiana versus Bailey found that, quote, the welfare of the child and the best interest of society require that the state shall exert its sovereign authority to secure to the child the opportunity to acquire an education, end quote. If that's a fancy way of saying it's good for everyone. What happened in 1923 in Meyer versus Nebraska? Quote, founded on the right of the state to protect its citizens, to provide for their welfare and progress, and to ensure the good of society, end quote. That's a fancy way of saying we need to protect ourselves from ourselves. In 1944, there was a court case called Prince versus Massachusetts. The U.S. Supreme Court declared, quote, acting to guard the general interest of youths' well-being, the state as parens patriae may restrict the parents' control by requiring school attendance, regulating or prohibiting the child's labor, and in many other ways, end quote. That's a fancy way of saying the government is a better and more powerful parent than the parents. Abuse and child labor laws and children competing with adults for jobs made the case for compulsory education stronger. When the factory jobs required more literacy, it seemed to cement the idea. Some people that are against compulsory schooling argue that forced schooling prolongs adolescence. Kids are able to work and would like to, but are not allowed. And then, well, they make troubles for society. In Pierce versus Society of Sisters in 1925, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that students could indeed attend private schools. The Amish had always had issues with compulsory education. They didn't want to send their kiddos to school beyond the 8th grade and would often resign to just saying, okay, I'll serve a small jail sentence or pay a small fine. However, the case of Wisconsin versus Yoder in 1972 set precedents that religious belief could lead to exemptions that would have to be granted by the local school board. What was argued that any benefit that would come from additional schooling would be satisfied through other Amish traditional means. Kids can be homeschooled in all 50 states, but there's always some accountability and conditions to be met by the parents for that to be granted. Given all that history, what do our attendance issues look like today?